Thank you, everybody. I show this first slide because it really is an amazing journey, as you already reviewed, Mark. It's been an amazing process, and I want to show kind of how we all fit into this and how you really fit into this as an important part of the team. I'm going to discuss the history because I think that's an important 5-10 minute discussion, particularly at the University of Washington. We were one of the major centers in this technology back in the 80s and early 90s. We're going to outline some of the advances in assisted technology so you can get an idea of the understanding of these words, what they mean, and how our laboratory is dealing with this from the cellular edge. And then for you to know how we use this knowledge, not only to treat patients, but also make diagnoses of what infertility is and what we need to do to treat it. And last, of course, from your end is really defining the role of the endocrine lab as part of Team ART. They really are a major part of this team, as you'll see, if you haven't felt it already. Past is interesting. The program opened at the University of Washington in the late 80s and continued to operate through into 2005 when it was closed for a variety of reasons. But at that time, it was really leading the nation. 500, 600 cycles of IVF was considered at that time a very large program. And it was a very diverse program, as you can see. Patients were coming in using donor eggs. Freezing of embryos was available, which was then back in 2000 a pretty new strategy. And fresh cycles were being used as well. The uniqueness of it was from an 87 on was the WAMI program. The satellite program served an incredible service to our 5-state community, providing educational resources, sources to update materials, and having members actually participate. And the lab was a very key part of this as we talked. We were talking in the past about that, is integrating almost 8 different labs in the 5-state area to have QA, which was quite amazing back then in terms of what we needed and how we were able to determine value of a 500 estrogen from Anchorage. How did that compare to our level here at the university? Provided convenience for the patients, and it really was at a time when ART, assisted technologies, really weren't that widespread in the country, and we represented a huge geographic area and provided excellent outcomes. It's important you know what ART stands for. There's a whole lot of different symbols and words. The main part of it is in vitro fertilization. In vitro in the glass or in the dish, meaning putting sperm and eggs together. Cryopreservation, saving embryos. Donors taking eggs from one woman, fertilizing with a husband's sperm and putting them back in the recipient person. Then thawing products, thawing embryos. And then lastly, surrogates and gestational carriers. So when you hear me use the word ART, it's all of this. It's not just in vitro. So we try to get away from the idea of just using the word in vitro fertilization. If you've not heard about this process, it's pretty amazing. We've learned in the last 10 years how to control ovulation production, how to make good eggs. Okay, and that's where the endocrine lab is a really key piece to this, as you'll see. Technically recover them by ultrasound techniques, so relatively minor surgery, going transvaginally and recovering them, putting them in the dish, fertilizing them either, quote, naturally by putting the sperm in the liquid and watching them fertilize, or actually mechanically injecting them. I'm going to show you a short video on this in a minute of how that works. Forming embryos, and then with the formation of embryos, putting them back and hopefully getting a pregnancy. The spin-offs have been starting to save tissue, so we can get thousands of eggs instead of just recovering 5 or 10. Freezing of eggs so that we have them in future use for cancer patients, patients with chronic diseases, and then saving embryos, and also assessing embryos, seeing what is a normal embryo, what's going to happen in this process. Activities in the United States have continued to go up, as you can see. This is the number of cycles in the U.S. beginning to level out, probably driven by the economics of the process. It takes $10,000 to $12,000 to do an IVF cycle. You can see the data. You say, well, gee, I'm not showing you the latest data, but remember, this is data for outcomes. So you have to have a baby. It takes 9 months to have a baby, and then you got to gather the data. So we're about 1.5 years to 2 years behind in getting our statistical data. But the new data is coming out at about 1,500 cycles. Center numbers are declining. Yeah, so in these times, small practices are closing down, and university programs actually are beginning to grow again because of the economies of scale provided by a university in providing excellent services. So the treatment idea has really been the focus for us as specialists in reproductive endocrinology, and being very focused on getting someone pregnant. That's been the goal. Can we get you pregnant? But there's really some other roles here, as you'll see in a minute, and this is probably the most exciting part from our end. In vitro being used as a diagnostic test. Say, wow, you know, you didn't get pregnant. I wonder if there's something wrong with your eggs, something wrong with the sperm. So we can now not only count numbers of eggs, but we can actually begin to determine their maturity. Are they metaphase 1 able to start to mature? Are they completely matured? Are they post-matured? Did they fertilize? Could the sperm get in there? Did they do it naturally, or did we do it mechanically by injecting the sperm? Same story with the sperm then. You could see if a guy comes in and his count looks good and the motion looks good, that doesn't mean the function's good, does it? And to be able to define function says it's a test. Put the sperm and eggs together, you can't get much better a test of fertilization than that in a quality lab. We can bypass it by actually injecting sperm. That's called intracytoplasmic sperm injection. The embryos are also a helpful diagnostic tool. We can actually see how fast they're growing and dividing. The cleavage rates now are pretty standard for us to know they advance over a 5-day period. They go from 2 cells to 4, all the way up to morulas, hundreds of cells, and then on to blastocysts. What the blastocysts look like also determine by their size, their number, and their symmetry, their ability to implant. So we grade them. We have a whole grading system. Someday, if you want to come to our lab, we'll walk you through how all of that works to be able to show that. And then the last piece is we can actually go inside an embryo, take a cell out of that embryo, as you'll see in the talk today, and actually analyze it and screen it for normality. As a therapeutics tool, the Center for Disease Control compiled this last data from the last data collection we have, and shows about 1/3 of the people coming through this technology are doing it for straight female factor problems. Something wrong in the way they're making eggs, some medical condition like diabetes, something wrong with the tubes, adhesions, endometriosis. They were born that way with an abnormality. We can bypass that by getting the eggs out, back in the dish, and then back to the uterus. And then the biological clock, the fact that as one gets older, fertility goes down, and can we bypass that by putting the eggs in the dish? Male factor is being addressed as well. About 20% or so involve male factor, but if you combine the male factor when you also have a female factor, look what you get. About 1/3 of the cases are male factor. This is oftentimes a hard sell to the couple. The guys say, well, my doctor sent me in with a normal semen analysis. It's not me. You know, well, numbers don't mean everything, as you'll see, in terms of count. Unexplained infertility, we don't know why it's not working, so let's find out and make it a diagnostic test. And other factors, as you see, fertility preservation and spontaneous losses. So University of Washington services, where are we? Well, we opened the program up in August of this year in terms of a lab, thanks to the work of the university, the medical school, the Department of OB/GYN, University Hospital. A commitment was made to reopen the program after being closed for 7 years. And basically, we brought things out of mothballs. But I jokingly told Dr. Eschenbach it was like taking a Model T out and saying to me, hey, what do you think about my car? So I had to politely tell Dr. Eschenbach that things have kind of advanced a little bit here. So we had to face those budgetary issues. But as you'll see, it's been quite an investment in terms of our success and outcomes. So the first idea is, can you put sperm and eggs together? Can you actually do this to bypass the potential for fertilization failure that might occur? So as I'm talking, I'm going to have you watch this video. Now remember, scale here. This is a holding pipette. Holding pipette, size of an egg, you can see. Holding pipettes are 100 microns, size of a human hair, a little bit smaller. Can you imagine our technician here? She's drawing up a sperm. Can you see that little white dot in there? Micron, 3 to 4 microns, size of a sperm. Okay, and then carefully penetrating the zona pellucida to enter into the cytoplasm. There you go. Putting it into the cytoplasm, drawing back cytoplasm to be sure you're not in the paravitellin space. You can see it come up there just a little bit, very delicate. And the sperm gets injected. We've learned over the years you have to line up the polar body to the top and bottom so that the spindles of the DNA process don't get interfered with. We didn't know that before. We'd inject them at different angles. So this radically has improved the fertilization for us. Used in severe low sperm counts, situations where the guy has an obstructed vas, and you just get sperm out of the testicle. Repeated failures of IVF, repeated failures where the doctor's been using clomiphene and saying, I don't know why you can't get pregnant. The sperm looked great and normal. Amazing information here that we get. You can see the ability to put sperm in is pretty darn good. Well, we can get them in there over half the time. Offspring, again, because there's male factor issues, aren't going to always translate into a baby, are they? They're going to translate into possibly an abnormal fertilization. And the success seems to be unrelated to the male's age, but is definitely driven by the age of those eggs. Second amazing technology is being able to take a cell out of an embryo, and I'll show you why we're doing that. It has to do with the new field of reproductive genetics. This is the science of being able to determine at the very early stage of cellular division, identifying what genes are involved in diseases, what genes are involved in translocation defects, and there will be a library probably in the next 5 to 10 years looking at infertile patients as to what kind of embryos do they make. Are they normal? How often are they abnormal? What would happen in nature as we do this? This is quite an amazing instrument here. This is a laser penetrating instrument. There are a few of them in the world, a handful really. We have one of them here. And by zoning in here, you'll actually see Karen DeLuz, our technical person here, being able to burn this zona away so that one of these cells can be removed. And as you're watching that, up here I'll show you what happens is we're putting the sperm and eggs together. The biopsy is done so that cell that comes out will then be sent off to the genetics lab. The embryos will continue in culture, and then we can now look at the huge advantage. Rather than just saying, well, there they are, they're dividing, we can actually break them into a cohort of normal and abnormal dividing embryos. This is a huge advance because in the old days we had to use hyaluronic acid to dilute this, and of course you can imagine the acid didn't stay just on the outside. There would be some penetration and damage to the cellular structures inside. So this is rather attractive from our end because you can fine-tune that. She has an ability to turn the intensity, which is the circles that you see around here, and she's very focused on the red dot. You see how that's digging a divot in there at that point. Pretty amazing process here. Again, less than 100 micron size. You're going to go in there and take this cell out, the one closest to you, send it off for DNA analysis and a determination of, quote, normality in the process. So here you see she's delicately getting through. The holding pipette's approached. Amazing sticky. The cell junctions are quite amazing at this level. You can't break too many of them away, otherwise the embryo will die. So you'll see she's very careful in how that cell extrudes and is pulled up into the pipette. And gently she's pulling it away there to break the cell communications, but not damaging the other cells, and beautifully removed. Okay? And then they're prepared and shipped. Amazing thing is it looked like it wanted to go back into the embryo there. He joked about why this video showed that, but it did. Lots of methods. I'm just going to briefly, we could spend a whole talk on the new methods, but CGH, comparative genomic hybridization, is really the goal for us right now. All 23 chromosomes can be looked at. We can amplify them very rapidly to get a lot of DNA within 48 hours. We can do hybridization studies very rapidly in this, and we have imaging software now that's quite good at analyzing chromosome numbers and abnormalities that we see. This is what it would look like on an array analysis for us. The future is right here in DNA chip assessment. This is quite amazing stuff that we can break each chromosome down into the genomic pieces, match father, mother, and embryo, and determine in single gene defects. We're all over the map right now, but we're definitely offering this to patients with X-linked disorders, autosomal dominant, and autosomal recessive, all kinds of diseases there that you can see, and just rapidly expanding and working with Edith Chang in our department. We're advancing the area of reproductive genetics at a very exciting rate. The other interesting idea is that, I mentioned to this earlier, is as women get older, the egg quality goes down. And we have indirectly known that in nature because the aneuploidy rate, the rate of abnormalities, have been tracked through the decades by what we see as trisomy 21 or Down syndrome. So we do know as women get older, the chance of trisomy 21 goes up rather dramatically after age 40. But so do the other defects, and so do the miscarriage rates. Miscarriage in young women is less than 8 to 10%. In a 40-year-old, it's about 30%. And a 44, 45-year-old is over 50% of the implants don't make it. So that means embryo forms, blastocysts release placenta and intracellular mass, but something's wrong. It doesn't continue in the process. We know it must be an egg problem because we can take a woman almost at any age, the oldest being 67 years old in California, where she took the eggs back from her daughter. Uterus was primed with estrogen and progesterone and had a successful pregnancy. Look at here. You can take a woman, use her as a recipient of a donor egg from a woman who's less than 30, and no matter what the age is, this is the national statistics for the US, you get about a 40-some% pregnancy rate all the way up to 47. Take that same woman and try to use her eggs, look what happens. Okay, rates go down. The numbers are so small here, the rate actually doesn't go up. That statistically, with the variation, it's basically flat at about 3 to 5%. So we do know this is amazing, but the big question is then, what's happening there? If this woman makes eggs, can we determine which embryo is a normal embryo and give her a greater chance of getting pregnant? So we're seeing it being used more and more in advanced maternal age because now we know with the aneuploidy we can find these. We can tell Mrs. Jones you got 3 beautifully dividing blastocysts, but only one of them is genetically normal. Those other 2 would have either failed to implant or caused a miscarriage in the process. Same thing with recurrent pregnancy loss. that miscarriages are very common in nature. And as I mentioned, as you get older, they're more common. These patients can come in and look for balanced translocation, situations that heretofore we never even thought about as issues causing loss. Male factor, guys with sperm issues that, quote, seem normal, but we do know if you look at men with no sperm, azoospermia, low sperm numbers, or abnormal quality morphology of these characteristics, you'll find abnormal karyotypes in them as you're starting to look at this. These are pretty primitive because in these severe cases, you can't even find some of the stuff. The microdeletions, for instance, which is the most common one, are too small to find in a normal karyotype. They're only found when we amplify them and take a single cell out of an embryo and go, wow, there's a male embryo, but it's got a defect on the Y. The husband doesn't show it, but we do know it's repetitive in all of the ones that we see. Repeated implantation failures, the ability here of an embryo to succeed. If somebody comes to us after failing in another program, we begin to counsel them saying, look, you've been to 2 excellent programs in the city or the region, everything looks normal to you, we got to think of something either wrong with the implantation site or something wrong with the embryo. So this has become very helpful in defining, I hate to use this word normal, but patients see this as a normal embryo. We call it a genetically analyzed embryo that indicates some normality. So the next few years, you're going to see a huge paradigm shift, I believe, in vitro fertilization. We're going to be using pre-implantation genetic screening. Diagnosis is when we're looking for a specific disease, but we'll do PGS to assess the selection of embryos for transfer. It will be a discriminator to decide, does this patient get embryos back or do they not? The cost is pretty significant. Look at the fact if we don't know what looks normal, what are we going to do? We're going to save it, right? So if Mrs. Jones makes 10 embryos and we're only going to put 1 or 2 back because we're so good at our technology, what do we do with those other 8? We save them. She doesn't get pregnant, or she does, comes back a year later, what are we going to do? We're going to thaw them out. But we don't really have an idea of what's normal. So when we get to this point, there will be tremendous cost savings that will be saving the best quality embryos. I think a potential legal issues on the horizon too, which is as this technology gets going and Mrs. Jones says, wait a minute, I had an abnormal baby, why didn't your program assess my embryo? Why didn't you tell me whether it was normal or not in the process? The other exciting area for growth that we've seen has been in this area of being able to save oocytes. In the freezing technology, as you have a cell, when it's in lots of little pieces, if you freeze across a gradient, it's like pebbles in a river or something, they all kind of coalesce together and the freezing and cooling process gets spread across that gradient. So we're able to save embryos that are dividing. We're able to save blastocysts that have hundreds of cells. But heretofore, until about 3 years ago, we didn't have the ability to freeze a mass, single cell mass of an egg. The heat would go in there, crystals would form and fracture the egg, so we couldn't do it. The Japanese created quite an amazing technology using an array of copper, like a copper matrix, so that when you drop the egg into that process and plunge it into the cold of the liquid nitrogen, the matrix freezes. So what you do is you create a shell around the copper around the egg, so the egg actually gets in suspended animation of sorts and never gets damaged. Our survival rates are quite amazing in the ability to save eggs and use them. That has opened up a whole new area, what we call fertility preservation, being able to save someone's eggs for future use. It's related mainly to chemotherapy and radiation treatments for cancer patients, but we're seeing it now in people on other chemotherapeutics like rheumatoid arthritis patients, patients with Crohn's disease, beginning to say, well, wait a minute, if I'm on this treatment and I'm 25 and I'm going to be sick for 5, 10 years, you know, I want a chance of getting pregnant in the process. We do know patients with other conditions are there. The approach is huge in terms of the team approach. It's outside the scope of today's talk, but as you can imagine, we have to have oncologists working with our people, working with surgeons, having the whole team together to be able to make this a reality for the patients. We do know cancer treatments accelerate aging. Lots of good data now saying that the longer somebody's on chemotherapy, the longer they're going to have menopausal-like symptoms as a woman. In the case of a man, loss of sperm production. So fertility is an issue, menopausal symptoms, sexual dysfunction, and long-term health issues such as cardiovascular are key. The effects do depend upon the agents. They do depend on how long you've gotten them, whether radiation was added to the process, and of course the age of the patient as the freezing process would be entertained. Again, as a schematic, I just want to show you, in the old days, this was a problem. Somebody had cancer diagnosed and the doctors would go, we got to treat you right now. And they would come to us and we'd go, oh, well, you know, she's not had her period, so we got to wait till the period comes on, and then we got to give drugs to kind of control that. So it would often take 2 to 3 months, 5, 10 years ago, to get an in vitro patient, quote, ready for egg recovery. New drugs and agonists and antagonists for GnRH have allowed us to come in at any time the patient comes in. She could be day 3 of the cycle, boom, we can hit that, shut off the pituitary, allow regression for 3 to 4 days in this luteal phase that you see here, and then come in and begin treatment. The moment we start, they know we're going to get eggs in 12 to 14 days. They're actually beginning their chemotherapy, the placement of the PICC lines and things that they need to do to treatment. For us right now, this is running about anywhere from 16 to 25 days. That's pretty acceptable to an oncologist to say, well, it would take me normally a week or 2 to get going anyway. The key for us is getting patients educated now to realize that this is available, understand the technology better is really the key. So the future for us, as I see it in this process, is really a very important team approach, of which, as you can see, the endocrine lab is part of this. We got the clinical up and going, we got our ART lab going, administration's pretty good. Now we're working on these 3 over here to say, how do we optimize this as a team? So what I'd like to spend the next 15, 20 minutes on is kind of the stuff that you might want to know about what we're doing that I think we've done a poor job in relaying to you about our needs in terms of the specifics. So let's start with the kind of patients that we have. There are really 3 groups of patients. Those undergoing baseline evaluation, those undergoing some type of fertility treatment with fertility drugs, and then the in vitro patients. Okay? Evaluation, pretty much baseline. They're going to be coming in, and very few of our patients have major medical conditions. We're looking for baseline values to tell us, is there anything going on with the thyroid? Is there any inability to not make progesterone? And lastly, what are the baselines for making a normal cycle? We've spent 10 years looking at this, and we have a pretty good idea that a ratio between estrogen and FSH is key. Drawing it between day 2 and 4 of the cycle is critical, and measuring a level of estrogen less than 40 is ideal with an FSH less than 10. When those parameters change and the FSH starts to go up, the estrogen starts to go down, we start to see declines in overall fertility. Very, very important. Anti-Mullerian hormone, very key piece made by the support cells to the egg. Last 5 years, a tremendous advance for us is that we're correlating this now to the potential of a woman to achieve a pregnancy, careful how I define this now, through in vitro. We're not quite sure in normal situations, but if a patient comes to us, needs in vitro fertilization, has an AMH less than 1, her pregnancy rates are statistically less than that of a population of the same age group. If they're in the range of 1 to 3, those are our best responders for pregnancy. If it's much over 3, fascinatingly, these patients have what's called the risk for ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. They over-respond. They make lots of eggs. It's kind of nice if you're trying to get eggs. The bad news is the lining of the uterus gets out of synchrony in these patients. So when you see these coming in as evaluations, you're probably not going to identify them much. They're just going to kind of come in and they're just getting evaluated. Once we make the decision to give them fertility drugs, we rarely see estrogen levels going up over 5,000. We're going to be using clomiphene, probably not even measuring estrogen because the levels are so normal. If we give to an injectable, we'll see some rise in the estradiol, but not that much. This is the group that we're going to talk about today, is the in vitro patients, because in these patients, we are serially obtaining estrogens. We're looking at them on a daily basis near the final phase where the eggs are growing in the follicles to a certain size to tell us these are quality eggs from the process. We measure HCG after we've given a shot of HCG. The HCG is used to release the egg, acts like LH in the process, so that's also a critical value that we get. And the progesterone, we'll talk about that in detail about how we look at that as maturing. So those are the patients. The cycles are actually pretty similar. When someone gets to stimulation as controlled ovarian hyperstimulation, they're going to go ahead and make an egg. They're going to have intercourse, or they're going to have sperm put in through inseminations. The in vitro patient has to do the same thing. They've got to make eggs, but they're going to make them more aggressively in the process. So if you looked at a schematic for this, somewhere in the cycle before the cycle you're going to do this process, you have to get control of the cycle. So we use a drug, Lupron, GnRH agonist, shuts everything down, shuts the production of GnRH down, estrogens go down, follicles disappear, corpus luteum go away, and we usually see a period. and that period comes on, and we know they're down-regulated. You'll see a blood come into your lab from us, and you may, if you start looking at the patient, go, whoa, they were normal before, now this level's 0. I mean, what happened? Okay, are they menopausal? No, they're nicely suppressed. Okay, we're looking for these levels. But we are also key because an elevated level here would indicate that they could have a remaining corpus luteum, and they're not ready to start. In patients that are undergoing regular ovulation induction, not for IVF, and you want to make only a few eggs, they don't get down-regulated. So they come in on their period, and then they start their drugs. All different kind of drugs. You can use recombinant FSH, menopausal type hormones, human menopausal gonadotropins. We add more hormone, and then we can add an antagonist. Antagonists are immediate actors on the central system, the GnRH. So I use it, I tell my patients, it's kind of like if you're driving a car and it's going too fast, you kind of slow down with the brake. That's the agonist. Now you got to speed up because you got to go up the hill. So you're going to release the brake and start putting some gas on. Oh my gosh, I'm going too fast. But I don't want to stop going fast because I got to get to my egg production, so I'm going to add a little bit of braking on. So you're braking and using the gas, and that's what it is with the antagonist therapy that we use. Incredibly successful for us. But the piece that we got to know is the parameters. How large is the support space around the egg? How much estrogen is being made by those eggs? So you can see if we have a level of 5,000 and have 2 follicles growing, that's a different story than having 10 follicles growing with 5,000, isn't it? And so those type parameters just become really key to get those values back in a time, because we're also going to be determining when to give our patients drug. So we'll be talking a little bit about timing, but to us, timing is really key. We need to get these values back so that we can call them by 2 in the afternoon so they can determine the next dose, because these are dose-sensitive responses that we're seeing. So how about estradiol? What do we know about that? Well, thanks to Mark, I found out that you guys we're using the Beckman system as an immunoassay. We're using it in a way, as you know, for now I mentioned to you, being able to look at the maturity of eggs overall and correlating it to the size of the follicles. But we're also using it to monitor therapy. How good are we in the process of making these eggs in the process? The specimens are in heparinized plasma or serum tubes, as I understand. Gel tubes have been acceptable, and I bring this up important because when I talk to my MAs and the nurses, nobody really knows what we're doing. And sometimes there's a mix-up of the tubes from our end. So we're going to need to start communicating better with our team to understand this. So I was very excited to get this information and share it with our team to say, you know, as we work together, what do we need to do? Stability is really important here because sometimes you'll hear us go, oh my God, we need this level repeated. And we were talking a little bit earlier about sometimes we like to run them on the same assay with the idea that, well, we don't want inter-assay variation, that we want to be able to see that. But then keeping them out, there's concentrating effects on some hormones, and that may not be a good idea. So those are the kind of troubleshooting that we need to start working on in the next few months to come up with some answers. The reports are auto-filed between 20 and 4,800, which is great for our patients that are just stimulating for normal stimulation. But for IVF, this is reaching our kind of critical stage window. That just think, if we're going for 10 to 12 eggs, which is our average, and the average follicle is going to be making 200 to 300 follicles, you know, the average patient may get into this auto-filing report, but the person making 15 or 20 eggs, what's going to happen there? Okay, we're going to be up around 5, 6, 7,000 on a fairly regular basis. And so dilutions become really key from our point of view. From our end, we kind of know when we need it, and we haven't really told you that, okay? And we probably need to start working on that, is how do we get that information to you to say, you know, today's value is 3,000, but I know when she's coming back in 2 days because I just did an ultrasound and she has 20 follicles, that level is going to double every day, and she's going to be 9,000, 10,000 in the process. So if we can anticipate that, look what that means, is when you get that sample, you can know immediately you have to dilute it. Okay? There's no reason to run it straight unless you have to by QA needs. But you know, we would be able to get that ahead of time. You'd be able to anticipate this, and that helps us out tremendously because, as you know, if you have to dilute, that means more time. We're waiting at 12 o'clock to get the results only to find out it needed its second set of dilutions. Okay? And so this would really help us out in getting the information back to the patients. So dilution is probably the name of the game for us here, is how do we get this working together so that we can understand the folds of dilutions that are needed. We do respect the fact that when you get over a really high range, you know, the variation is going to go up, and we do know that, and that's something I want to try to educate my practitioners to, that a level of 12,000 isn't really 12,000, is it? You guys know that. It's probably somewhere between 10 and 14. There's a window, and whatever it is, we probably need to start educating our practitioners to realize that when we're getting those high values, we got to put that into the formula as well and say, okay, what's the margin of error? What is it? You know, we're going to have to accept what it is because we can't change the level, yet we have to use that in our thinking process. Interference, really there's no significant interference that I could come up with in the process. Cross-reactivity, we're not giving any other estrogens, okay? So that's good news for you guys to know. There's no other estrogen on board in the patient who's undergoing IVF, okay? In the patient going through frozen embryos, yes, they're getting estrogen and progesterone back, but we're seeking normal levels, 200 units of estrogen, 300. So it wouldn't worry us from that point of view of any low-level cross-reactivity. Precision data is key for us in this process, as I alluded to. As we get the higher and higher dilutions, we need to start thinking about how do we report that in a way that's acceptable for us to be able to use that data to say what quality egg are we getting, what kind of eggs are we going to get in this process. So I think the key on the estrogen assay is we need to start setting up some communications, try to help you see what we see every day, which is the anticipation of the high levels, and give you some sense of, you know, time to dilute. It's going to be 12,000. That means more than a 2 times dilution, and be able to help you in that process and in turn help the patients. Progesterone. Similar type assay, immunoassay. We use it to measure the maturity. So not just the count now, but the maturity. As the eggs grow in the follicle and the signaling occurs from the support cells, and we're driving this thing with the gas on and then hitting some brake action, is that egg is starting to sense it's time to mature here. It's time to change in what we're doing. The first sign of that is the conversion in the steroid pathway as cholesterol gets into pregnenolone and pregnenolone gets the progesterone. It no longer goes down the delta-4, delta-5 pathways to the androgens and estrogens. It starts to block up. The microtubules break away from the support cells. The cyclic AMP goes down. Progesterone levels go up. In quality labs that are really looking at this and looking at assay measurements, there is a lot of talk in the last 2 years of if we sure as heck could get that progesterone assay more precise and more accurate, if we could see the difference between a 1.3 and a 1.9, I'm making up numbers, okay, but in essence the progesterones really are always less than 3 or 4 by the time we're ready to recover the eggs. That centers that are looking at this are saying, wow, we now can use that number to determine to give the injection to mature the egg sooner. So if I know today the estrogen looks good, but I'm going to wait 1 more day because I think I want to get some more eggs. If that progesterone was accurate and I knew it and trusted it, if it came out at 1.9 or 2, I'm going to give that drug to mature now because guess what's happening? Those eggs are starting to mature. For me to push that gas pedal more to try to make them grow, I'm going to lose those. So I'm going to lose the quality eggs to try to grow some new eggs. And that happens to us a lot. We'll get 20 eggs of which 8 or 10 will be dead, of which 4 or 5 will be good, and 4 or 5 will be immature. That's not good. Okay? We would like to get 10 good eggs, and that's it. We don't want to make 20 eggs to get 10. If we could just make 10 good ones would be ideal. So this will become very important in the next year or two for us to be able to define this to get to the maturity level. The second piece of it is the adequate luteal phase. So after we have the eggs recovered and the embryos formed and they're implanting, is do we have enough support to the uterus? And we measure those progesterones to determine that at the time we get a pregnancy test to be sure we have an adequate level. Similar to the estrogen, it is a sample that we collect over at Roosevelt in serum. We try to avoid time-related absorption, but these are really important issues because I do get nervous at times on weekends that, you know, what are we doing? How are we drawing it? The MA may keep it sitting there for 2-3 hours because we saw the first patient at 7, and then we had an egg recovery, and then we came back to see somebody, and they didn't want the courier to come over twice, so they batched it. Okay, and as I started to read about this, I went, I think we need to start exploring this, that our weekends are probably going to be a little varied in terms of what we're doing in terms of getting those samples in. Same thing with tubes. There's a confusion. I asked the MAs today of what happens. They, well, let me see, is it a striped tube? You know, I don't know. So I don't even know if you guys are getting the right tubes. I mean, it'd be awful if you're not, and what we have to do about that. So important to know that most of the time on progesterone, we're not going to need to worry about it. It's going to come back with a pregnancy test. It's going to come back in the luteal phase. It's going to be less than 40 in the measurements. So we don't really worry about dilutions anymore in this process. But it's this anticipated expected value of these low levels that are really going to be affecting us in the process. Similar to the estrogen, there's no significant interference. But unlike the estrogen, there is a potential for cross-reactivity in the luteal phase, because we are giving progesterone back to support. Fortunately, from the lab side, it's a lot better today than it was 2-3 years ago, because the standard 2-3 years ago was injectable progesterone. Mega doses. You need to give about 10 times the dose IM to get it to the uterus that you can deliver transvaginally. So the world has moved to a transvaginal progesterone now called Crenome. That product can give us and deliver to the uterus, increases the serum levels only marginally, 5, 10, 15 units. So we're now seeing progesterones less than 40 consistently in our IVF patients, where with the injectable we were getting 100 units. So I guess the good news of the program having been closed the last few years, you didn't see that, okay? But that used to be as much a headache, if not more, than the estrogens, because the levels of 120, 130 were outside the range, and dilutions were being done, and nobody really knew how valuable those levels were. So our work today will be going at the low end. I'm not worried about the high end in any way, shape, or form for us. So precision is going to be key here for us. I got to explore with you ideas here. We got to get creative to figure out how can we better look at that peri-ovulatory range. How can we determine the day before I was going to give the maturing drug that that's the time I should have given it? Or if I am going to give it, did I give it too late, and do I need to process those eggs quicker in the laboratory? The lab can inject sperm faster rather than wait the usual 4 or 5 hours. Maybe we need to get them in right away. So these would be kind of exciting things for us to improve patient quality and care as we look at this analysis and assessment. The process. As we get bigger and more patients are coming through, I think it's important you understand how this thing goes in terms of cycles. I showed you an IVF cycle over a month, but we're not doing them all the time. If we're doing them all the time, we would be 24/7, and we would be having some very irritated anesthesiologists doing surgeries at any hours of the day and over the weekends. So we made an agreement as the program got started to batch cycles. What that means is, remember I showed you the agonist, the brake? You can keep that brake on for 7, 8, 10, 20 days actually. And so we can juggle patients in that first phase so that they all batch. They all come together in that process. And we have an active calendar. We're actually calendared out through December now. So we could know and could share with you this is when the volume and activity is anticipated to occur for us. On the daily basis, the blood draw is also an issue for us. That the process is less varied now than it was probably 6-8 months ago, but we are seeing people early, 6:30, 6:45, 6:30 tomorrow morning. And we're finished our bloods by the time we're ready to go do an egg recovery at 8:30 or 9 o'clock. And yet sometimes those bloods aren't being drawn then. It kind of amazes me. The ultrasound's done and the patients go get breakfast or something, they come back at 10 o'clock and get their estrogen. So our team needs to understand what your needs are, as well as us getting to you kind of how that works in the daily monitoring process. We got to get the values back. Okay, and to us, 2 o'clock is kind of our, we get nervous point, because they're going to get an afternoon drug injection of the gas pedal, the gonadotropin. And so we got to determine that, and we hate to make that decision just, well, I guess it's going to be okay. Let's just give it to them and see what our estrogen is. So that's important. Within the EPIC system, we have a synopsis. So I don't know if you can get access to that from the lab or how we could share that with you, but that would be pretty cool from your end as looking at this. You would actually be able to see what we're doing, and once we all get educated together, you'd see how these follicles grow, and that would help you again with the dilutional processes and all and what we're doing. We have an ART monitoring data, which is also part of our data collection, where on a day-to-day basis you see what we're doing with our drugs. We put the estrogens in there. They're not auto-entered yet from what we could find out on EPIC, but so we're manually putting them in, but it's helping us determine when to give that HCG trigger so that we know when to mature the eggs. So the trends we're seeing is we got to dilute. We don't have to dilute. Are we going to look at progesterone before, because I'm worried Mrs. Jones' eggs aren't quite growing right and the estrogen's kind of flattening out, not rising up at the usual 50% rate. So, I got to get a progesterone on that patient and see what happens. We do this every week. We have our weekly team meeting, URC, University Reproductive Care. We meet from 1 to 2 and be happy to invite, someone from your group maybe to join us in one of those, or kind of walk through some of the ideas that we talked about. I showed you this because when I asked the team today, kind of like, well, what happens? Well, yeah, we collect the bloods here, and then we want the values back here. Like, well, I said, well, there's kind of stuff in between. And oh, yeah, there is? I mean, it's just amazing from a practitioner point of view. They don't get the fact that, blood has to get sampled, and it has to go through some standards, et cetera. So that may help us to be able to, gently walk through an educational session from your side coming to our side and saying, let's just walk through how this works, okay? And I think that'd be very helpful and great insight for everybody involved. So I see optimizing blood draws as a real important issue. When it's done, the kind of tubes we use, what we're supposed to be doing for dilutions and all that. Increasing your understanding of our volume may also help you in terms of when you need reagents. You know, when is the big volume going to come in? When is there going to be no volume in the process? What are the cycle trends? When are we going to see this rate going up? When are the dilutions going to be needed? And educating us to your schedules and the precision and accuracy, I think, will go a long way to helping us understand what we're doing with our patients. The future is very exciting. As you can see here, we're anticipating 80 to 90 cycles. We opened in August of this year. We're anticipating through growth and the support of the medical center and the department and the university that expanding the services to include patient diversity, looking at donor gametes, looking at surrogacy, other issues that will increase this process. The reproductive genetics, a huge piece that Dr. Chang and I are working on and seeing more and more patients along this area. Then in the future, sometime, this dialogue is going to start. The whammy doctor is going to say, hey, I remember that program. You know, what's going on? We'd like to get our patients enrolled. So again, we're not going to talk about that today, but somewhere in the hopeful near future, we're going to see that happen. So what does better defining your role as part of this whole thing bring? I think it brings, from our end, a tremendously improved understanding of the science of this, of what can we do to get better fertilizations. That makes the patients gain a lot of confidence. They get it. They say, wow, that's pretty cool. You know, now I understand that role of the hormone levels. It allows us to synchronize our surgeries better with the other scheduling needs, and long-term care of the patient is better. Of course, our total goal is babies. Okay? That we're going to make more babies in the process. So conclusion, I've taken you down a long journey, relatively long, 20-some years, to show you that we're back. The ART Center at the university is now a center of excellence, in my opinion, both clinical and in the laboratory area. Advances in ART are allowing us to have dramatic improvement, not only in getting people pregnant, but in diagnosing why they're not getting pregnant, and expanding our services into the male fertility areas, reproductive genetics, and fertility preservation. That this team ART is truly a team of incredible specialists, dedicated and committed to getting our patients pregnant. And I truly see the engagement of the endocrine lab as a member of Team ART as a key to enhancing the reproductive care at the University of Washington. Well, thank you very much for your time. Any questions? Yes?
Thank you very much for the talk. It was great. My question is, this is a lab-related question. So samples are collected at 7 to 9 a.m. and results are required at about 12:45. So in the ballpark, what is the number of samples that needs to be looked at?
Right now, just I'll give you kind of an eyeball, we're seeing this, 70, 80 a year, which is translating into 6 or 7 patients a month. We're now in a batch right now. I'll be scanning 7 people tomorrow morning for IVF cycle starts. So you'll be seeing 7, 8 samples came from that process. It will intensify next week because they're all going to get daily blood, so it will amplify. So each of them will be getting additional blood, and other patients will be coming in to finish their cycle. So you'll probably get 10 or 12 in that process. A lab in the range of 150 is usually going to be running about 8 or 10 estrogens every day, because we'll have to break away from the batching. We just can't do it anymore. It will be too intense. So we'll be seeing patients all the time. That will necessitate more staffing from our end, but that will smooth things out from your end as well. Yes.
So do you have to compete with an unnamed local fertility clinic that's sort of on Westlake in terms of egg donors? Is it hard to get enough egg donors?
We don't have a donor program right now. I felt it very, very important that we had to establish a laboratory. We had to establish these kind of relationships before we start to get into that. So we've not approached that yet. We have it on the books for now. We probably will not go recruit donors. I had done that in my private practice in Laguna Niguel and realized it's very rewarding, but it's also incredibly stuck with litigious issues, and I would rather just simply use agencies, and there are 3 of them in the city that recruit young women, and that's probably the way we'll go. Yes?
What's known about long-term stability and viability of these stored ovocytes and stored embryos?
Yeah.
And
Good question.
Is there some decline over time? Or?
Our consent clearly says we do not know that answer. Okay, that freezing eggs can be done, they can be thawed, they've been done over a year or 2 or 3. What will happen 10 years from now, we don't know. And so that is the incredible leap of faith these kind of patients are taking. And it's really very touching and difficult for me, particularly to deal with these families, because you've got parents dealing with a young girl in her early teens with a cancer, and do you not want her to be fertile in the future if she survives this? And who's going to say no to that? And so they're stuck with it, yet we feel bad to say to them, well, we're not so sure what this is going to mean. If we have the option that this person is married, okay, has a breast cancer, unfortunately diagnosed at 29 or 30, and they've been delaying having a pregnancy, that's doable because those are embryos. Sperm can enter eggs. So the cancer patient either falls into the egg freezing piece, which is unknown, as you alluded to, or the embryos, which is very established for us and very comfortable with that dialogue. Yes?
Yeah, I'm just curious about what is the latest time in the morning you would describe as being the optimal time for sample pickup in order to have it delivered back to the laboratory for
That's a quick question, Marks. You know, we would want our IVF patients' data, IVF only. We don't need the routines and the screens and all that stuff, but the IVF ones, we want to be calling them back between 1 and 2. So we want to see those values in the chart and be able to review those and go to the lab and calculate. You know, it takes us half an hour to calculate everything once we get the estrogen. So that's what we got to back into, say, you know, I don't know, what time do you guys need to get those? And can we speed that up by doing the dilutions ahead of time, you know, thinking ahead of time? I don't know, but yes.
Well, we just have had requests for recurring multiple pickups during the day in the last couple of weeks. So I was curious about that because there have been, on occasion, a request for a stat turnaround time, and we have our logistics of organizing the couriers and then also.
I think in any new relationship, there are going to be problems, okay? And I think that's probably what happens is somebody forgot, oh my gosh, the IVF patient didn't come in until 10, okay? She needs the blood now, we got to get a courier over. So it's going to take that kind of communications to say to somebody, okay, this is why it has to happen this way. And then I think the culture will start to realize you can't put that IVF patient on at 11 and expect to get the value back at 12. Now there'll be extenuating circumstances. Tomorrow I got a lady who is coming in at 10:30. She lives down in Olympia. She's got a business meeting at 8. She's not a critical value. She's going to be in her first phase, so we don't have to call her back. So again, that may need a courier to get that one, but it's not urgent. Okay, that doesn't have to be at 12:45. And that's the kind of dialogue you guys need to hear. Is okay, she's doing this, she's an exception, but don't have to worry about it. But that's the kind of stuff we have to work out. Yes.
Another question I have is what's known about ova stem cells, and the old model that a girl is born with as many ova as she's ever going to have may not be true, and there may be some ways to develop new ova within the ovary, and there may be ovarian stem cells. Can you fill us in about
Great question. The early data that I lived off of when I was a student was, you know, you're born with so many million, and then, you know, as an adolescent you have so many million, and then when you're menopausal you live less than a million. That study comes from a single study in the Lancet in 1887, where they biopsied 3 women, adolescent. Yeah, honest to God, when you look at it, you go, this has been in all the major texts, and nobody cross-checked it. They started cross-checking it in the 80s and said, wait a minute, okay? And what we're finding is it's genetically driven. And we don't know where on the X chromosome and whether there's cross-communications, but you know, we know this from Turner syndrome patients that they make no eggs. And so there's this piece of the X chromosome, and this is an exciting area of research to start asking these questions. Is, you know, there are ovaries, and when you start doing wedge resections in ovaries of women who've been tragically killed in an accident or something, is you find concentrated areas that they're not all making a million eggs. There may be a million in this piece, but none over here, and every person seems to be different. So huge research coming down the road on that.